morning. So this is part 8 of my Women Who Run with the Wolves series by Dr. Clarissa Pinkola Estes. And today we're going to be talking about the story of the red shoes. We're going to be talking about self-preservation as well as the idea of soul famine. So in this chapter, the author tells us the story of the red shoes. So just a little quick version of how it goes. An orphan girl creates a pair of homemade red shoes and is then taken in by an older woman. The older woman is like, okay, well, we're going to make your life better. So she takes these homemade red shoes and throws them away and burns them. And then as they go through a little bit of time, the woman takes the little girl to a shoe shop where she gets this bright red pair of shoes. And the old woman's blind, so she doesn't know that they're red. And the child becomes very enamored by these shoes. And she causes a whole ruckus at the local church with them. And the older woman takes them away and is like, okay, no, you can't have these shoes. And the child, who realizes that the old lady is blind, takes the shoes and puts them on again. Then she meets an older man who later is the devil. So that happens, who shines her shoes and the child can't take them off. And the issue is that the shoes keep forcing her to dance, and it's causing an even bigger ruckus. So the old woman does manage to shove the shoes off of the child, and then the child, who doesn't know when to stop, goes and puts them on again. And then the old lady at this point is dead, so that's fun. She's dead, and we can't get help from her anymore, so the child finally, who's being forced to dance either until she dies or figures something out, gets her feet chopped off. So I was a little, when I read the story, I was like, okay, I don't know how this relates to anything. But then the author actually did kind of make it make sense. So that's what's cool about this book, is all of these different stories really do have a point to them. And it's not just, they go beyond fairy tales, if that makes sense. So the author talks about the homemade red shoes, and she kind of talks about it as a metaphor for our own vitality and our own thirst for life. And through life, it requires sacrifice and it's hard, but we do have our own homemade red shoes that we have. And it's almost like the little girl, even though these shoes were clumsily made and they were just made with scraps of fabric, they were still hers. And the author kind of talks about how when we sacrifice too much in our life, we end up yearning for the wrong types of things, cheap thrills, cheap sex, things like that. And when we kind of lose ourselves, when we lose our homemade red shoes, that's when we start to give into these bad habits. She also talks about us giving into the easier path in life, and how by doing that, we make ourselves unhappy, and we kind of lead into this concept that she introduces called soul starvation or soul famine. And what happens is when we experience a period of soul famine, we end up, when we finally come out of it, and she does talk about coming out of it, but that's going to be something in another chapter. When we finally come out of this period where we have been deprived of something, we have a tendency to go overboard when we come back. So sort of like how the little girl didn't have anything, and then she becomes really fascinated with these shoes, but these shoes are leading her down a dangerous path. And she keeps going back and she keeps going back. The author kind of talks about this when she talks about how a lot of times in life, if we're not careful, we have a tendency to take the easy way out, such as getting into marriages of convenience, getting into jobs that are not necessarily, they don't help us grow, but they're just easy to do. And when we do that, we don't have fulfillment. And when we finally get out of that situation, that's when we start falling into that area of excess, because we don't know our own limits, because we have been starved for so long that now we want everything all of the time. And it's almost like when we have this freedom, we go overboard because we don't think we're going to be able to be free again. Another thing that the author talks about that really stuck with me is she talks about how we eventually get used to the violence and trauma that happens in our lives, and that leads to learned helplessness. And when we have that learned helplessness, we kind of end up in that soul-starved period, and we give up on ourselves. We give up on our passions, our spiritual nature, our creative nature. I remember when I was in a not great situation, and that happened to me. I felt like I was kind of gone and I didn't really care about anything. I didn't really care about my creative aspect of my life, or the things I did create weren't necessarily as great. And the author says that this happens because we kind of normalize the abnormal. So we get used to being in this terrible situation that we kind of stop caring, and we just realize that it's not for us, and we do eventually leave. But in order to do that, there kind of has to be that moment where we recognize that we are the only ones who can change our circumstances, and we're the only ones who can kind of take that stand. Sorry, there's a fly. The author also talks about freeing ourselves from our soul famine by acknowledging first that we are starved and that we have to reverse that. And I think that's something that happens to a lot of people. When I was in a not great situation, I had to eventually get kind of shaken awake and be told that by life and by myself that this is not what you want. If you stay here, this is going to be your entire life. And that really hit me because that was not the life I wanted to live. And I finally had to get myself out of that situation. And when I did get free again, I had that moment of excess. I had that moment where I was like, oh my God, I can do anything I want. And I kind of started falling back into behaviors that were not the greatest for me. She talks a lot about how we have to have boundaries with ourselves during this time. And we have to recognize when we've had too much excess. We do have to not only set boundaries with the world around us, but we have to set boundaries with ourselves too. And we kind of have to limit ourselves. She also does talk about being patient with ourselves, and I can agree with that. Like, I think the first year of me being out of my kind of crazy situation, I was definitely lost and getting out of hand, but I had to sort of understand that I was healing, and eventually that sort of led me back into the spot that I wanted to be in. Another thing that she talks about that really stuck with me is she talks about how we need to kind of avoid hanging out with people who have the same traumas as us. Yes, our traumas can bring people together, but sometimes if other people are not in the same spot as us, what happens is we end up falling back into old habits. And that's something I can definitely agree with, because I had a lot of friends who I was mainly their friend because we'd been through a lot of similar instances, and then come to find out they weren't really on the same path of healing as I was. And if I did hang out with them more, I would continue to fall back into my old ways. And it's kind of a hard lesson to learn because you don't want to leave anybody behind, but at the same time, for your own self-worth and your own self-preservation, you kind of have to do it. So this chapter was interesting to me just because it was almost a little bit more complicated for me to understand. So I really had to take my time with it. But I also really liked it because it was a lot of pointing out my old behaviors and keeping me kind of aware so that I don't fall back into them again.